In 1985, Apple's board fired the man who founded the company. He walked out with one box. The stock barely moved. Nobody thought it mattered. 12 years later, Apple was 90 days from bankruptcy. The board called him back. What he did next turned Apple into the most valuable company in human history. This is the Apple story. It begins not in a boardroom, not in a factory, in a garage in California in 1976. 2 men, 1 idea, 0 money. Steve Jobs was 21 years old. Steve Wozniak was 25. They had no investors, no office, no plan beyond the next few weeks. Wozniak had built a circuit board, just a circuit board. No keyboard, no monitor, no case. But Jobs looked at it and saw something nobody else did. He called it Apple. Jobs sold his Volkswagen van to fund the first production run. 200 units, sold through a local computer store. It was enough. In 1977, the Apple II launched, the first personal computer designed for ordinary people, not for engineers, not for corporations, for homes, for families, for anyone who had ever been curious about what these machines could do. It changed everything. By 1980, Apple had real revenue, real products, and real momentum. And Jobs made a decision that would make history. He took Apple public. December 12, 1980, $22 per share. The biggest technology IPO of its day. The biggest IPO since the Ford Motor Company in 1956. On listing day, the stock jumped 32%. It closed at $29. Dozens of Apple employees became millionaires in a single afternoon. Steve Jobs, aged 25, ended the day worth $217 million. A journalist at the Wall Street Journal wrote, "Not since Eve has an apple posed such temptation." Apple was now a public company, and Jobs was the most famous young entrepreneur in America. But success created a problem. Apple was growing faster than Jobs could manage it. The board wanted a professional CEO, someone with corporate experience, someone who could run a large company. Jobs agreed, and in 1983 he recruited John Sculley, then the CEO of PepsiCo, to run Apple. Jobs convinced him with one line. He looked at Sculley and said, "Do you want to spend the rest of your life selling sugared water to children? Or do you want a chance to change the world?" Sculley joined. Then, in 1984, Apple launched the Macintosh, the first consumer computer with a graphical interface, a mouse, icons, windows, the kind of machine you navigated by pointing and clicking rather than by typing commands. The launch advertisement, directed by Ridley Scott, ran once during the Super Bowl. It is still considered one of the greatest advertisements ever made. The Macintosh was a technological marvel, but it was expensive, and sales disappointed. Tensions between Jobs and Sculley escalated. Jobs was running the Macintosh division like a company within a company. He had his own building. He flew a pirate flag above it. He operated by his own rules. The board had seen enough. In May 1985, Jobs was stripped of his responsibilities. He lost control of the Macintosh division. He was given a title, but no power. Jobs tried to fight back. He attempted a boardroom coup, privately approaching board members to oust Sculley. It failed. The board sided with Sculley. In September 1985, Steve Jobs resigned from Apple. He left with one box. He was 30 years old. He had built one of the most famous companies in America from a garage, and the board had just shown him the door. What he did next, nobody expected. He started again. Jobs founded a new company called Next, built high-end computers for universities and research institutions. Powerful, elegant, expensive. Most people ignored it. But inside Next, Jobs was building something more important than hardware. He was building a next-generation operating system, one that Apple would eventually need very badly. Meanwhile, Apple was falling apart. Under new leadership, the company launched product after product that nobody wanted. The Newton personal digital assistant, the Pippin gaming console, computers that were too expensive for ordinary consumers and too underpowered for serious users. The stock fell below $2. By 1996, Apple had a new CEO, Gil Amelio, who had been brought in to save a dying company. Amelio was a turnaround specialist. He understood the financial problems. He understood the operational chaos. What he needed was a new operating system. Apple's existing software was aging and could not be rebuilt in time. He needed to buy one. He looked at two options, BEOS from a company called B and Next Step from a company called Next. BEOS founder Jean-Louis Gasset wanted $300 million. Too much. Amelio called Steve Jobs. In December 1996, Apple acquired Next for $429 million. Gil Amelio said at the time, "I'm not just buying software, I am buying Steve." Jobs returned to Apple, not as CEO, as an advisor. The man who had founded the company was now technically a consultant to the people running it, but he was inside and he was watching everything. Amelio thought he could control Jobs. He was wrong. Within months, Jobs had quietly built relationships with every senior person at Apple, every engineer, every product manager, every board member. Then, in August 1997, Jobs did something nobody anticipated. He stood on stage at Macworld Boston and announced that Apple's biggest rival was investing in Apple. Microsoft was putting $150 million into the company. Bill Gates appeared on the giant screen behind Jobs. Jobs looked up at him and said, "Thank you, Bill. The world is a better place." The Apple audience booed. Their hero was thanking their biggest enemy, the man whose Windows operating system had spent a decade taking market share from the Mac. Now Jobs was calling him a partner. But the deal was not surrender, it was survival. Microsoft's investment kept Apple alive long enough for Jobs to do what he had come back to do. And here is the investor lesson hidden inside that moment. Apple stock was trading at under $1 per share the day Gates appeared on that screen. Under $1. The company that would become the most valuable in human history was trading at under $1 while the audience booed the man who would take it there. Anyone who understood what was happening in that room, who understood that Jobs was back inside the building and that a new operating system built on Next technology was already in development and bought Apple stock that day, made one of the greatest investments in history. 1 month later, the board made it official. Gil Amelio was out. On September 16, 1997, Steve Jobs became interim CEO of Apple. His nickname, iCEO. The first i product Apple ever created, before the iMac, before the iPod, before the iPhone. He walked into Apple and did one thing first. He called a meeting of the entire product team, and he cancelled 70% of everything in development. Apple had dozens of products in various stages. Printers, monitors, servers, cameras, multiple lines of Macintosh computers, each targeting a different customer. Jobs drew a simple 2x2 grid on the whiteboard: consumer versus professional, desktop versus portable. 4 boxes, 4 products. That was Apple now. Everything else was cancelled. The engineers were furious. The ones whose projects had been killed spent days arguing with Jobs. Jobs did not change his mind. He was right. Then, in 1998, came the iMac, designed by a young British designer named Johnny Ive. Translucent, colorful, curved, like nothing the computer industry had ever produced. You could see the machine inside. It came in 5 colors. It cost $1,299, and it sold 2 million units in its first year. Apple was profitable again. Then, in 2001, the iPod. 1,000 songs in your pocket. The music industry had spent years fighting digital music. Jobs did not fight it, he organized it. iTunes, a legal way to buy one song for 99 cents. The music industry eventually had no choice but to follow. The iPod sold over 100 million units in 6 years. Then, on January 9, 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco in his black turtleneck and said, "Every once in a while, a revolutionary product comes along that changes everything." He paused. Today, we are introducing 3 revolutionary products. The first is a widescreen iPod with touch controls. The second is a revolutionary mobile phone. The third is a breakthrough internet communications device. Another pause. An iPod, a phone, an internet communicator. An iPod, a phone. Are you getting it? These are not 3 separate devices. This is one device, and we are calling it iPhone. The audience erupted. At the time, Microsoft's CEO Steve Ballmer was asked for his reaction. He said, "There is no chance that the iPhone is going to get any significant market share. No chance." Apple sold its millionth iPhone in 74 days. Apple sold its billionth iPhone in 2016. The iPhone changed everything, not just for Apple, for every phone manufacturer on Earth, for every music company, for every taxi company, for every newspaper, for every bank. The iPhone did not just create a product, it created a platform. In 2008, the App Store launched. Developers could now build applications and sell them directly to hundreds of millions of iPhone users. Apple took 30% of every transaction. Then, in 2010, the iPad. Then, Apple Pay. Then, AirPods. Then, Apple Watch. Each product adding another layer to the same ecosystem. Each customer who bought one Apple product was pulled deeper into a world of Apple products. This is what Jobs built. Not a hardware company, a platform, an ecosystem. A world that was very easy to enter and very difficult to leave. In August 2011, Steve Jobs resigned as CEO. He was too ill to continue. Tim Cook took over. On October 5, 2011, Steve Jobs passed away. He was 56 years old. The tributes came from every corner of the world. Products were placed outside Apple stores. Strangers gathered. People who had never met Jobs and never would wept in public. Because he had built things that lived in their hands and in their lives every single day. Under Tim Cook, Apple did something extraordinary. It proved that the company was bigger than its founder. Cook expanded Apple's manufacturing. He built Apple's services business into a $50 billion annual revenue stream. He pushed Apple deeper into India. 1 in every 5 iPhones sold in the world is now manufactured in India. Apple exported nearly $6 billion worth of India-made iPhones in a single 6-month period. The App Store ecosystem in India generated over 44,000 crore rupees in 2024 alone. In August 2018, Apple became the first company in history to reach a $1 trillion market cap. In August 2020, $2 trillion. In January 2022, $3 trillion. Today, Apple's market cap stands at $4.63 trillion. Apple is the world's second most valuable company. Now the investor story. If you had invested $1,000 in Apple at its IPO in 1980 at $22 per share, you would have bought 45 shares. After 5 stock splits, those 45 shares became 5,040 shares. Your $1,000 investment would be worth over $2 million today. If you had bought Apple stock the day Gates appeared on that screen in 1997, the day the audience booed, when the stock was trading at under $1 per share, and held it to today, you made over 300 times your money. The investors who sold when Jobs was fired in 1985 missed the iPhone. The investors who sold when Apple was 90 days from bankruptcy in 1997 missed the iPod. The investors who sold when the audience was booing in August 1997 missed the greatest run in corporate history. 3 things the Apple story tells you as an investor. First, the best buying moments look like disasters. Apple at under $1 per share in 1997 was 90 days from bankruptcy. It was being rescued by its biggest rival. The founder was technically just an advisor. Every signal said sell. Every signal was wrong. The investors who bought understood something the sellers did not, that the brand was still alive, and the man who built it was back inside. Second, platforms compound differently from products. When you bought Apple in 1997, you were not buying a computer company. You were buying every product that company would ever build on top of that operating system. The iPod, the iPhone, the App Store, Apple Pay, AirPods. None of those existed yet, but they were all made possible by the decision Jobs made when he cancelled 70% of products and focused on building a coherent platform. That is what you buy when you buy a great platform business, not today's product. Every product it will ever make. Third, great businesses outlast their founders. Jobs died in 2011. Since then, Apple has added $3 trillion in market value. Tim Cook took a company worth $350 billion and grew it to $4.63 trillion. Cook's Apple has been more valuable than Jobs' Apple. The lesson is not that founders don't matter. They do. The lesson is that a great founder builds something that compounds without them. That is the difference between a company and a legacy. In 1976, 2 men built a circuit board in a garage. In 1985, the board fired one of them. In 1997, they called him back when the company had 90 days left. He cancelled 70% of everything. He launched the iMac, the iPod, the iPhone. He changed the world. Then he left, and the company he built kept going. At $4.63 trillion and counting. The stock never forgot what the product was. Neither should you.